Good day, this is Lawrence Houlgate, the author of Understanding John Locke. The subtitle is The Smart Student's Guide to Locke's Second Treatise of Government. We finished episode 15 last week, and we're going on to 16 today. That's the episode number. If you have the book and you're reading along with me, then we are in chapter 11. And the title is Separation of Powers. It's one of the most consequential chapters in the book. Locke was not the first, but one of the first people to want to divide power in the government in order to avoid wrongdoing by people who are given too much power. So, chapter 11, Separation of Power, episode 16. There are three types of political power: legislative, executive, and what Locke calls federative. Legislative power is the right to direct how the force of the Commonwealth shall be employed for preserving the community and the members of it. The right to direct the force, not to be the force, but the right to direct it is the legislative power. Executive power is the power to see to the execution of the laws that are made and remain in force. And federative power is the power of war and peace, leagues, and alliances with all persons and communities without the Commonwealth. All of this can be read at paragraphs 143, 144, and 145 of Second Treatise. So legislative power is just the right to make law, and the laws direct the force of the Commonwealth. And, of course, the force is used to preserve the community and the members of it. Executive power is the power to see to the execution of those laws that are made and remain in force. So the executive is giving walking orders by the legislative, and they go out and the executive tries to apply the law, we hope, as fairly as possible. Federative power is like our State Department, I would think, the power of war and peace, leagues, and alliances with other countries. In the United States Constitution, legislative power is given to the legislative branch of government consisting of Congress, the House of Representatives, and the United States Senate. In Locke's day, legislative power in England was shared by the House of Commons, the House of Lords, and the King, or the Queen. In the United States, executive and federative powers are both given to the executive branch, including the United States President and various executive branches, for example, the Department of Homeland Security, the State Department, the Department of the Interior. Locke also places executive power and federative power in the executive, making it possible for one person to have both powers. So he doesn't really separate those. In the United States, judicial power is given to the judicial branch of government, which is responsible for interpreting the laws passed by the legislative branch and enforced by the executive. And it's a bit surprising that Locke doesn't give us the judiciary as a separate power. Locke doesn't recognize it as a separate power, nor does he stipulate a judicial branch of government overseeing a court system. And one explanation for this omission is that, quote, Locke did not think of interpreting law as a distinct function, because he thought it was a part of both the legislative and executive functions. That's a quote from Professor Tuckness, who has written extensively on John Locke. Both the legislative and the executive must interpret positive law in light of the law of nature when creating, changing, and executing the law. So Locke just thinks that there's nothing left for a judiciary to do. It's already there. We might ask what happens when there is a disagreement between different entities who are given legislative and executive powers. In a perfect system, those who exercise legislative and executive functions would always agree about how the law is to be interpreted, and that must be why Locke sees no need for an independent judiciary. And yet, as Locke has previously argued, one of the great benefits of civil society is that there is, quote, an independent judge, recognized by all, and who is always on hand to settle disputes. So it's a mystery. I'll leave it to you to think about. That is, why the judiciary, although he recognizes a judiciary, Why doesn't Locke give it a separate and distinct power? Let's talk some more about separation of political powers in Second Treatise, chapter 12. And in my book, chapter 11.2. Locke was one of the first political philosophers to argue for separating legislative and executive powers. He had two arguments for this. Since laws do not always need to be made, it is not necessary to have a legislative body that is always in session. Laws must occasionally be created or changed, but this can be done in a single week or a single month, depending on the size of the Commonwealth. This is not the case with executive power. Laws created by legislative power are constantly to be executed. The executive never gets a day off. And force is always to continue. Therefore, it is necessary that there should be a power always in being, which should see to the execution of the laws that are made. Now, of course, the fact that the executive power, unlike the legislative, is always in being, as Locke puts it, that doesn't itself provide an adequate reason for placing these powers in different hands. Suppose that the people who appointed the imaginary monarch, Queen Makeda, transfer to her not only the power to enact new laws, but also the power to judge and punish offenders as well. If there are only a few laws to be created every year, then Queen Makeda would have plenty of time left to judge and punish offenders. And if she's lazy or otherwise engaged, she can always assign these tasks to her subordinates. But monarchs sometimes ignore the interests of the community by putting the law to their own private advantage, and they exempt themselves from obedience to the laws that they made. That's in paragraph 143. That sound you're hearing is the printer that is unfortunately next to my desk. Locke once again appeals to his low regard of human nature by doubting the ability of persons with political power to put aside their own interests and execute the laws objectively. So that's the problem. Monarchs sometimes ignore the interests of their communities by putting the law to their own private advantage. Locke's monarch does not have the power of Plato's Gyges. The monarch is not invisible, but with dual powers of legislation and execution, she does not need invisibility. She could visibly favor herself. She could visibly favor her family and friends when executing the law. Therefore, Locke argues, placing the legislative and executive functions into the hands of different persons is the obvious solution. The supreme power in any form of government is the legislative, to which all the rest are and must be subordinate. This is section 11.3 in the book. This power is fiduciary, meaning that it is given with the people's trust that it will be used for protecting their life and liberty. Since there may be occasions in which the legislature acts contrary to this trust, Locke says the trust must necessarily be forfeited, and the power devolve into the hands of those they gave it. Suppose, for example, that the appointed legislators, the ones we elected, carry on designs against the liberties and properties of the subject, of you and me. Such behavior is contrary to the unalterable law of self-preservation, and the people will always have an inalienable right to defend themselves by taking back that legislative power. Hence, the ultimate decision about the placing of the supreme power shall always lie with the community, with the people. And thus the community may be said in this respect to be always the supreme power. But once a government is formed, and the legislative power has been handed over to a single person or to a group of persons, then that person or group is supreme, at least until the time that the government is dissolved and the legislative power is once again in the hands of the community. In all those cases in which a government has been formed, the legislative is the supreme power. Let's repeat that. The legislative is the supreme power. And Locke goes on to say, all other powers in any members or parts of the society derived from and subordinate to it. So both executive and federative powers are visibly subordinate and accountable to the legislature and may, at pleasure, be changed and displaced. We might add to this that executive and federative power could not exist apart from the legislative. If there is no power to legislate, there can be no execution of the law. Executive power without legislation is blind. Legislative power without an executive is impotent. Hey, you want me to say that again? You can quote it to your friends, and they'll say, wow, this guy knows a lot. Executive power without legislation is blind. Legislative power without an executive is impotent. Section 11.4. This is from Treatise 15, Paternal, Political, and Despotical Powers. And it's not until this chapter, chapter 15 of Second Treatise, that Locke finally gives us an answer to the question that he posed way back in chapter 1. What is the difference between political power and the various other types of power that persons exercise over others? The word power means a moral or legal right to do a named action. For example, the right of a legislator to create a law, the right of a police officer to arrest a person suspected of a crime, the right of a judge to pronounce guilt or innocence, or the right of a parent to restrain her young child from engaging in dangerous activities. Locke gives a summary of paternal, political, and despotical power in paragraph 173, which I've paraphrased in the following way. Just follow along with this. Nature gives paternal power to parents for the benefit of their children during their minority, to supply their want of ability and understanding how to manage their property. And remember, by property, he means not just goods, but liberty as well. Voluntary agreement gives political power to governors for the benefit of their subjects, to secure them in the possession and use of their properties. And forfeiture gives despotical power to lords for their own benefit over those who are stripped of all property. So let's go back to the beginning. Nature, he says, gives paternal power to parents for the benefit of their children while they're growing up. Voluntary agreement gives political power to governors for the benefit of their subjects, to secure their subjects in the possession and use of their properties. And forfeiture, that is giving up power, that gives despotical power to lords for their own benefit over those who are stripped of all property. That's paragraph 173. Now, paternal power is nothing but that which parents have over their children. That is, paternal power is that power which parents have over their children. Parents have the right, or the power, to make child-rearing decisions, for example, what clothing to wear in freezing weather, what foods to eat for breakfast, how much daily exercise their child should have. Locke says that it is nature that gives this power to the parents. Paternal power, though, is not voluntary. It's not based on an agreement or contract between parent and child. It also has a limited dominion, ending when the child comes to the use of reason, or a state of knowledge wherein they are supposed to be capable, as are their parents, to understand the moral and legal rules that they are to govern themselves by. When children come of age, they are no longer subject to parental authority unless they consent to this. Quote, the power of the father does not reach at all to the property of the child, which is only in his disposing, the child's disposing. Although a 25-year-old adult might give her parents the power to decide what she shall eat, where she shall live, and what clothes she shall wear, most grown children do not do this and would not hand over these powers to their parents. Not at age 25. Let's now talk about political power, now that we have some grasp of what paternal power is. There's a significant difference between paternal and political power. Political power is voluntary, and it always reaches to the property of the individual member. When members of the natural community mutually consent to create political or civil society, they give up into the hands of society all of their legislative and executive power. They are coming out of the state of nature, so they have to give it up into the hands of society. Trusting, Locke says, that it shall be employed for their good and the preservation of their property. The end of this, the end and measure, Locke says, of political power, when in the hands of the magistrate, is to preserve the members of that society in their lives, liberties, and possessions. If political power is paternal, then the end and the measure of political power would be to take care of all citizens as if they were children, ignoring and interfering with their lives, liberties, and possessions whenever it is determined that this is for their own good. So Locke carefully wants to distinguish between political power and paternal, even though a lot of people in his days were thinking of the political power as a father, as a parent. And Locke wants to disabuse you of that notion. We are not to think of the legislature or the executive as a kind of parent for us. And finally, despotical power. Despotical power is the power that is most associated with slavery. It is, quote, an absolute arbitrary power, and that one man has over another to take away his life whenever he pleases. It is a power that does not come from nature, for nature has made no such distinction between one man and another. In the state of nature, recall what he said way back in paragraph 4, all people are equal, one amongst another without subordination or subjection. And secondly, despotical power is not a power that comes from voluntary agreement, for man not having such an arbitrary power over his own life cannot give another man such a power over it. The origin of despotical power is forfeiture, quote, which the aggressor makes of his own life when he puts himself into the state of war with another. If Leroy harms or threatens to harm Betsy, then they are now in a state of war. Leroy is the aggressor, and as such, Leroy forfeits his own life to Betsy, giving her despotical arbitrary power over him. Locke uses the example of captives taken in a just and lawful war. The captives are not masters of their own life, and thus they cannot make a contract with those who captured them. Because, Locke says, for what compact or contract can be made with a man that is not master of his own life? If they are captives, they remain in the state of war with their captors and are liable to be destroyed by those the captives have injured. Well, that takes us to the end of Chapter 11. Thank you for listening, and that takes us to the end of Episode 16. And we'll see you next week. We'll hear you next week, or you'll hear me next week, for Chapter 17, which is, I think, extremely interesting, and it might even be, we might relate it to some things that are going on in the United States right now. The title of this next chapter we're going to read is Conquest, Tyranny, and Dissolution. Okay? Talk to you then. Bye-bye.